Okay, I might start. Can you hear me at the back? Can you hear me? Yep. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about the online quiz, which takes place next week. So there are no lectures or tutorials next week. On the Wednesday, in your lecture time, but not in the lecture theatre, in your lecture time, you'll be able to access your online quiz. So make sure that you're enrolled in a lecture and that you know which lecture it is that you are enrolled in on SciNet. So make sure you've got access to a reliable computer and internet connection during the lecture time. When your lecture time arrives, you'll be able to access a link that is in the assessment folder, the online quiz folder, under assessment on Blackboard. Once you open the quiz, you'll have 90 minutes to complete. So it will, after 90 minutes, it will submit. Please start your quiz promptly. So if you're in the 8 a.m. lecture, start it promptly, because you can certainly start your quiz at 10 to 10 if you're in the first lecture, or in your case at 10 to 4. But after 4 o'clock, if anything happens and that quiz closes, you won't be able to reopen it. Okay? So my advice to you is to start your quiz early in your lecture time. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay. So there are 19 questions, 16 are MCQ, and 3 are written practical questions. So the first one is a large question, it's worth 12 marks. The other 2 are worth 6 marks each. So the topics covered in the quiz are topics 1 to 4. So not this week's lecture material, but this week's tutorial material, and everything before that. The lecture today is important because it's the topic that's covered in your first case, which comes out the end of the beginning of the following week. So I'm very glad you're here, because you do need to fully understand this material as well for your next piece of assessment. So when you open the link for your online quiz, you'll see the following. These are the instructions, and then you can just press begin. So the instructions are just about the time limit being 1 hour and 30 minutes. And telling you that it will save and submit automatically when that time expires. It tells you the test can be saved and resumed, but only within that 2-hour period. Okay? After that, you can't resume it. So, the 3 practical questions. So on your ECP, it said there were 4 practical questions, but I have merged 2 into 1 so that you get the same material. You don't have to read more material for the second question. Okay, I'd advise you to do your calculations not directly into the answer space, but to do your calculations on a piece of paper or if you're using an Excel spreadsheet, that's fine. But then to type your answers into the space provided. Now, you can use a table to present your answer. There's that option, and you're also able to expand and contract the answer box as you're answering each question to make it easier in terms of formatting. Do provide your workings, because if you make a minor error, we can give you consequential marks and carry your minor error through. So for the MCQ questions, there's only one correct answer. But for these questions, obviously, it's open-ended. And it's a mix of calculations and interpretation, and, you might be asked some theory. Okay, so there's multiple parts to the questions. Does anyone have any questions about that? I did tell you, as we went through the material, that you will definitely have a cost of goods manufactured and sold practical question. You can be pretty well assured you'll have a question from job costing, and a practical question related to the material you covered last week and in this week's tutorial on the department cost allocations, support departments to operating departments. So is everyone clear on this? I'll put these slides up on Blackboard so that you can re-refer to them before you sit the quiz. Everyone, yep? Cost of goods manufactured and sold from the first week. So everyone will have slightly different questions. They're randomly assigned to your quiz. So it's highly unlikely if you're sitting beside someone doing the quiz, you'll have the same questions. Okay? Okay. So if you have technical issues, I've got the website and the phone number for IT support. The same situation applies, that if you don't sit the quiz, you get a mark of 0 unless you make an application for a deferred, and the information about that is in your ECP. If you're granted a deferred by the examinations officer, that's not me. I don't have any say about whether you get granted a deferred or not. She sends me a list, and then we agree upon a mutually agreeable time. So, as I said, the MCQ, there's one correct answer. Short answer and problem-solving questions will be marked on the basis of completeness and accuracy. You need to read the questions carefully, and you'll get partial marks be awarded for if the workings are correct, but you've got a minor error in, there'll be consequential marking. So it's a big undertaking, the marking. So the more clearly you present your answer, the easier it is to mark, and the more likely you are to get all of your marks awarded that you are entitled to. There'll be consultation next week, and I'll put this consultation timetable up for you in the slides and also on the Blackboard. Does anyone have any other questions about the quiz? So my biggest tips to you, oh yeah? Nope. You can do the quiz wherever you have internet access and a computer. But make sure that you do it in your lecture time. Okay? Yeah?
So you stressed us just write the answer in the box, not write the calculations. Yes.
Sorry, you write the calculations. Present your workings. If you don't show me how you came to your answer and you get your answer wrong, you get no marks. Sorry, I don't understand what you're saying to me.
You actually need to write it like the plus.
Yeah. Your workings, how you came to that number. Yeah. Is that okay? Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so there's another couple of things I wanted to cover with you. I've been checking the analytics on the Blackboard site and noticed that not many people have actually accessed the tutorial answers. Does everyone know where they are on the Blackboard site? Yeah? Yeah? Does anyone not know where they are? Yeah? Okay. So if you go into the course and you start the course, you'll find that you can watch the video, it tells you to read the text, download the lecture slide. Now, you can complete the quiz, and once you complete the quiz, and this quiz does not have any marks associated with it, we can see how well you did on the quiz, but If you just want to go through and not worry about answering, that's up to you. But the purpose of these questions is to give you some experience in answering the quiz. Once you've done that, you should be able to access the tutorial solutions. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? So you need to do the quiz. It's an adaptive release, and the purpose of that is to get you to practice your MCQ questions. It's not to assess you, but to give you some experience with the types of questions. Is everyone good with that? Yeah? Do you know where they are now? Okay. Okay, my other housekeeping request is we've got the MCQs in the lecture slides, and we'd really like it if you could participate by downloading Echo 360 onto your smart devices. So these are the instructions. You just download from your App Store Echo 360. Has everyone got a smart device? If you download Echo 360 and you log in using your email address, your student email address, and click Submit, it should ask you then to put in your UQ username and your password to log in. Have I gone too fast or you're okay? So once you've entered your email and submitted username and password, and then it should give you a privacy agreement, which you just close once you've read it. And then accounting 2102 should appear. If it doesn't, you close the app and go out and back in. Has anyone successfully done that? Is it working for you guys? Oh, okay. Well, hopefully that will happen in the quiz. Anyone had luck? Any luck? Did you get it to work? Yeah, great. Okay. So you can follow the presentation, move to the slide in the app when we have a quiz question and you can answer in that question. Okay, great. So today we're talking about activity-based costing systems. So this, as I said, is the topic that the first case is related to that you need to submit. So it's an important topic because it's about refining your costing systems. And remember that this semester so far we've talked about all this introductory material. We developed a cost of goods manufactured and sold. We did cost behaviours and cost volume profit analysis in the second lecture. That will definitely be on your quiz where you'll have to do some MCQ questions around that. Then we did job costing. That was traditional, simple job costing where we use a single plant-wide rate. And last week's material was the first phase of cost system refinement, where we learnt about techniques we can use to allocate our service or support department costs to our production departments. So we have more than one allocation rate. Today we're going to talk about activity-based costing, which is a further refinement of a costing system where we develop cost allocation rates based on the activities that we do to produce our product or service. Okay, so what we'd like you to be able to take away from this lecture is identify when cost systems should be refined and explain under and over costing. Understand the guidelines for cost system refinement and the principles of activity-based costing. Identify costs and limitations of activity-based costing, and understand how activity-based costing relates to activity-based management. And also consider how service and merchandising companies might use activity-based costing and management. Okay, so this relates to some of the material we've done before. We want to identify when cost systems should be refined, and that just means that we make them more sophisticated and hopefully more accurate. And we want to explain undercosting and overcosting of products. So just a very basic example where we have a company that makes basic calculators and financial calculators. And you see that the number of calculators that they sell is much higher than the number of basic calculators and the number of financial calculators. But they also differ in terms of what goes into making those calculators. So the more complex calculator uses more direct labour hours and more direct material and more direct labour. The cost is higher per unit and the cost allocated per unit is higher than for the basic calculator. So how accurately does using a single plant-wide rate for cost allocation really reflect the use of resources, what goes into those calculators? So you can imagine that a financial calculator, and we know it takes more labour and more material, so we would imagine that it would also use a lot more overhead per unit. But whether one cost allocation rate accurately reflects, particularly if it's volume based, if it's based on the number of units rather than the type of activity that is required to make that particular product. So remember last lecture, we talked about some examples where there were some differences between the use of different departments by different products and how if we actually captured that with our costing system, we got a much more accurate cost rather than just using an average. Well, this is a similar situation because a plant-wide rate is just an average based on the volume that you produce. And that may not capture the complexity of the more complex product, and that might result in undercosting the complex product and overcosting the simple product because we're just using an average. So the simple traditional costing system, so we use those terms, alternate those terms, simple and traditional. They use this volume-based allocation rate, which allocates indirect overhead. Remember, indirect overhead is overhead that we can't trace to our cost object in an economically feasible way using volume. It might be the number of units that we produce, it might be the direct labour hours, it could be machine hours. And this plant-wide rate can cause overcosting or undercosting because it doesn't capture the difference in the use of resources by different products. It's not always an issue because remember right at the beginning of semester we said not every company will have the same costing system. And the reason they don't is because they all produce different products. Some companies, if they just produce one type of product, can use a simple costing system. If I have more than one product and those products differ in complexity, that's when I might need to refine my costing system to avoid the problem of overcosting my complex products and overcosting my simple products and undercosting my complex products. Okay, so an example, if a company is making pens and they make 200,000 blue pens and they're running at capacity, which means that they have no more space in their factory or on their machines to make more pens, but there's demand in the market to make other coloured pens. To make these additional pens, the company invests in another plant, so another factory that is the same as the existing one with the same capacity. And the cost of the equipment, etc., is the same for both plants. In the second plant, they also make 200,000 pens, but they differ in the colour of the pen. They still use a plant-wide volume-based overhead allocation rate, but management's unhappy with the financial results. And all the pens have been sold at the same price, but the company has increased cost per pen, so reduced profitability per pen. So this is a situation where you'd start to think as a management accountant, why has this happened? We're still making pens. Why is my profitability per pen decreased? And assuming nothing's changed in the market, you'd start to think, well, am I accurately costing my pens? Because there might be something different in the making of a red pen than the making of a black pen. That means that using an average doesn't actually capture and give me an accurate cost. So other factors apart from volume can affect the incurrence of indirect costs. So indirect costs might be driven by some complexity within the actual manufacturing process. So it might be that for blue pens, I can set up my machine to make blue pens and I can make 500 at a time. But for red pens, I can only make 250 red pens in one batch. So to make the same number of blue pens as red pens, I have to do more batches of red pens. Okay? So the number of setups used to produce the required number of units of each product might mean that there's a difference in the indirect costs of setting up the machine for the blue pen versus the red pen. The number of parts required for each product unit that need to be ordered and handled might differ. So my ordering costs might be different for a blue pen and a red pen if a red pen requires an extra part. The number and time of quality inspections required for each product might differ, so I might have to actually spend more time or check more of my red pens because there's the higher defect rate. It can also differ because the degree of product diversity. So if I make two products that are slightly different, that would mean that I might get some benefit from refining my costing system to avoid undercosting one and overcosting the other. But the more diversity I have, the more potential benefit I have, because using a broad average, a plant-wide rate, is going to result in more over and under costing the greater the difference between my products and the more products I have that are different. Because these products consume resources in systematically different proportions. So understanding your actual process of how you produce your products is very important when you're designing your costing systems. Okay, so the impact of using a simple costing system, a traditional costing system, when a more accurate system is required, is that some products will be overcosted while simultaneously you're undercosting other products. And this is called cost cross-subsidisation. So the product that's being undercosted is being cross-subsidised by the product that is being overcosted. So the simple product is bearing more of the cost and it's subsidising the more complex product which has been undercosted. So typically that cross-subsidisation occurs when low volume complex products are undercosted and high volume simple products are overcosted. And the problem with this is we use our costs to set our prices. So if we're undercosting our complex products, we're likely to underprice, which means we might have a lot of market share. Other people may not be able to compete with us, but it might mean that we're missing out on profits that we could make on each unit. We get inaccurate product profitability analyses because our costs are wrong, and we might make inappropriate strategic decisions. So what might happen if we've overcosted our simple products? We might decide that we're not competitive even though we're good at making that product, because other people are out in the market able to produce and sell it for less. And that might be an inappropriate strategic decision because actually it's not that we're not good at making it and we're not efficient, it's that our costing system doesn't accurately collect the data on our costs. Okay, so this slide just repeats what I've been telling you about cost cross-subsidisation. It's a very important term that you need to be able to not only understand but apply in a case. So product undercosting is when a product consumes a relatively high level of resources but it's reported to have a relatively low total cost in comparison to a simpler product that's overcosted. That's a product that consumes a relatively low level of resources but is reported to have a relatively high cost compared to the other product. Okay, so we now know that we've talked about in previous weeks this traditional simple costing system where we use a single plant-wide rate to allocate our overhead based on a volume cost allocation base. And now we want to know the guidelines to refine that system. So when should we refine from using a simple system to a more sophisticated, refined system? If we have an increase in our product diversity, if we start making more products that are different and require differences in process complexity, if we have an increase in our indirect costs, so if a very large proportion of our costs are indirect, we need to have an accurate way of allocating those costs, otherwise we're going to get inaccurate costing and pricing. Also, if we get more competition in our product markets, that means that we need more accurate costing so that we can compete with our competitors on price. So we want to refine if we need more accurate costs for decision making. Simpler cost systems have in the past given us distorted product costs that lead to managers making poorer decisions. So the question we need to answer is, do our reported costs reflect the way costs are actually consumed? Now, costs are consumed through activity. Activity is what uses resources that cost money. That's the basis for activity-based costing. We recognise that it's activities that are using resources that cost money, and therefore we use activities as our cost pools and to create our cost allocation rates. That's why it's called activity-based costing. So to refine our cost system, the first thing we do is we make sure that we try and identify as much, the biggest proportion of our costs that we can, as direct costs. So we want to spend some time and work out if we can actually trace more of our costs to our cost objects, and that will reduce the extent to which costs have to be allocated. The question is, should they be traced? You review all your costs and work out if it's economically feasible to trace them to the cost object. The second thing that we do is we increase the number of indirect cost pools. So remember, when we used a traditional system, we just had one indirect cost pool. That was our manufacturing overhead. Okay? We accumulated all our indirect costs in that overhead account and we allocated based on a single rate. What we do now is we recognise that different activities have different cost drivers. So if I'm talking about setting up batches of production, it might be the number of batches I produce that causes those indirect costs, those setup costs to change. So we want to put in all of our costs that are the same, driven by the same cost driver, into a homogeneous cost pool. That's all that homogeneous means, that the costs are similar because they're driven by the same cost driver. And we want to make sure that we're not spending too much money making more accuracy if there's no benefit. We want to use causal cost allocation basis. So we want to identify for a particular activity, the costs associated with that, what it is that actually causes those costs to change. So we want to make sure that we have a causal cost allocation base for each of our cost pools. Remember last week's material, we talked about refining costing systems by creating support department allocation rates, and that was to ensure that we got more accurate product costs than using a simple costing system. But that's not going to work if you have a lot of product and process, so product diversity and process complexity, because those departmental rates still used volume-based cost drivers. They didn't recognise that activities are what use resources and cause the costs to change. So these departmental rates are still traditional volume-based allocations. There's certainly more rates, more pools, because they're based on the support departments, but these can be inaccurate if there is a large proportion of indirect costs and the proportion of those costs that are not related to volume is large. And overhead costs to total activity costs is large. And there's a lot of product diversity. So then we have to move to an even more refined system, the activity-based costing system. So what are we talking about when I say volume activities? So they're activities that are performed each time a unit is produced. So if I make jars of jam, every time a jar of jam passes me by, I have to put a label on it. That's a unit level activity. That's a volume activity. Non-volume activities are activities that are performed each time a unit of product is produced, but are performed for each batch. So it's not for each unit, it's for each batch or each order or for the product line itself. So for example, the setup costs I was talking about before, you might have a batch of 500 units or a batch of 100 units, but you still have to set up the machine. The costs are the same for each batch, not per unit. For each order, it might mean that when a customer rings up and makes an order, it costs you money to take that order and enter it in, but the size, the number of units in each order will differ. It's the cost per order that stays the same. Okay, so just thinking about what I've just told you, if we are ordering direct materials, would you consider that to be a unit level activity? No. So you're not necessarily ordering for each unit, you'll be ordering to produce a number of units at a time. So it's not related to a particular unit. What about B, making a sales call? No, that's not unit level. What about preparing equipment for a production run? No, that would be batch level. So you're going to produce a batch of your product. Your batches might have different sizes, and therefore it's not actually unit related, it's more batch related. What about placing a label on each unit manufactured? Is that unit level? Yep, that's a volume-related activity. What about inspecting each item? Yep. What about inspecting the first and the last items in a production run? A batch level. So that's not a unit level activity, that's a batch level activity. We all good with that? So, if we take this example of a printing business which has two jobs. Job 1 has 1,000 units in it. So someone's rung up and said, I want you to produce 1,000 leaflets. Job 2 has 100 units in it. Another customer only orders 100 units, 100 leaflets. The costing system is a simple costing system. It allocates overhead to each job based on the units of output. So it's a volume-based, unit-level allocation. If setup costs are $1,100 each time for each job, and only 2 setups are required for the period, how much cost would be allocated to each job? So in this case, all we would do is times 2 by 1,100, because there was 2 setups, so that would be 2,200, and we would divide that by the total number of units. 1,100 units, so we would have $2 per unit, and then we would apply it or allocate it by saying, for job number 1, 1,000 units at $2 is $2,000. For job number 2, 100 units at $2 is $200. Now, is that fair to job number 1 and job number 2? They both use the same amount of activity. They both require a setup. The setup costs $1,100. So actually, we're undercosting job number 2 and overcosting job number 1, just because we've used a volume-based average. So this slide just, and I apologise for this, all the formatting goes out when it goes into Echo. Okay, so this just shows you what I just said. We're using an average, a plant-wide rate, taking the total setup cost divided by the total units, so it's $2 a unit, and then applying it to the number of units in each job. So you can see for job number 1, we've allocated 2,000 in costs, job number 2 is 200, but really, both jobs incurred $1,100 worth of setup. Okay? So it's not an accurate reflection of the actual consumption of the resource. So each job, if we're using a more refined costing system and we recognise that it's a batch level cost, the setup cost, and there's one batch in each job, we should allocate $1,100 to each. The large job is therefore $1.10 per unit. The small job is $11 per unit. Does that make sense to everyone? Because we have much fewer units in the second job than the first job. All good? And it's the nature of fixed costs, how they behave. Okay, so using the volume allocation base, just using the $2 per unit, we got cost distortion. So we overcosted job number 1 because we actually allocated $2,000 and we should have only allocated $1,100. And we undercosted job number 2, even though it used a large amount of resources, it only had a small volume of output, so it only got allocated $200 of those costs. So the solution is this activity-based costing system. So we want you to understand and be able to apply these principles of activity-based costing. So remember we said not all companies are going to have to use this more sophisticated, refined system. If they're not only producing one product that's all the same or 1 or 2 products that don't really differ in complexity or in the process, it's not going to be necessary to do this. So ABC should be used when you have a large proportion of indirect overhead costs. There are significant non-volume related overhead costs, so costs that aren't related to the units themselves. They're related to the batch or the product or the facility. And you should use it when the product diversity is high. That means you make lots of different product lines that differ in their use of resources. So product diversity is greater when different products consume overhead activities in systematically different proportions. So how can we tell if this is the case? We can calculate a consumption ratio. So a simple example, we go back to the deluxe and the regular. And down here we have these different activities. So we know the total cost of each activity. So these would be the cost pools. We'd have a cost pool for setting up equipment, a cost pool for moving goods, a cost pool for machining, and a cost pool for assembly. And we know the total cost is 4,000. So we can see that deluxe uses more setup hours than regular, 3:1. They use more moves than regular, 6:4, and fewer machine hours, 10:4, and fewer direct labour hours. But you can see we're producing less of the deluxe than the regular. So what do I mean by consumption ratio? All we do is for each of the activities, we work out the ratio of the activity required for deluxe versus regular. So back here, with setup hours, it was 3:1. So the ratio is 75% to 25%. Does that make sense to everyone? And for the number of moves, it was 6:4. And so the consumption ratio is 60% to 40%. All good? So we can see that the deluxe uses more of setup and moving relative to regular, but less machining and assembly relative to regular. Remembering that we produce more of the regular than we do of the deluxe. Okay, so if we just used a plant-wide rate, we would just average all of that out. We'd lose the accuracy of our costing because we would just give an average cost based on the number of units that we produce, not on the activities that are required to produce our product. Okay, so this slide just is a diagram trying to summarise what we hope you now understand. So the plant-wide overhead rate that we talked about in traditional costing was that single overhead rate that we calculated and we applied or allocated to our product based on the volume, either the number of units that we produced or the direct labour hours that went in or the machine hours, etc. Then last week's material, we then refined that system by allocating based our support department costs to our production departments before we allocated to our product. This week, we're using an even more refined system because we're creating cost pools based on the activities and then allocating those costs to our product based on the amount of the cost driver, which we hope is causing those costs to change, and therefore it's a much more complex but hopefully more accurate system. Okay, I'm going to give you a 10-minute break and I'll start again at 5:02 and then we'll keep going. But please come and talk to me if you have a question in the break. Okay, so with activity-based costing, it's this two-stage approach where the first stage is that we recognise these resource costs and we create these cost pools based on the activities that use the resources, and we create as many cost pools as we need so that those costs in those cost pools are as homogeneous as possible. So they're similar, they're driven by the same cost driver. And then we, in the second stage, allocate those costs to products or services or customers by creating activity rates, just as we did when we created a cost allocation rate. But we'll create them one for each of the cost pools that are activities. So when we implement ABC, it's a 7-step approach. We have to, as we always do with a cost system, identify what our cost objects are, identify the direct costs of those cost objects, select the activities and the cost allocation basis for allocating those indirect costs, identify indirect costs associated with each cost allocation base, calculate a rate for each activity, calculate the indirect costs allocated to each product, so that's allocating using the rate, and then calculate the total cost of the product by adding together the direct costs, which remember are our prime costs, direct materials and direct labour, and all of the allocated activity costs. So we said the thing about using activity-based costing is that we recognise that not all of our activities are unit-level activities. And in activity-based costing, we talk about this cost hierarchy. So some costs, some activities are unit-level, some are batch-level. So we set up a machine for a batch, so those setup costs are driven by the number of batches. Some are product sustaining level. So it might be that we have 5 products. For product A, we have costs, activities that we only do for that product that we don't do for product B or C or D. And they're product sustaining activities. Or at the highest level, we have what we call facility sustaining costs. So these are costs of activities that can't be traced to an individual product or service, but they're at the whole facility level. So the cost of actually paying for our factory where we produce all of our different products. So these costs are non-unit level costs. Okay. So an activity. This Decadent Delights makes custom ice cream by mixing various sweets into vanilla or chocolate ice cream. Their orders range in size from 250 ml to 2 litres. After each order has been mixed and packed into 250 ml containers, the mixing equipment must be cleaned. So what we want to know is the cleaning the equipment, is it an example of unit level, batch level, product level, or a facility level? So if you could please find your slide and enter your answer in your Echo app. Did it work for you? Oh. Are you able to get access? Oh, it worked this morning. Is anyone able to access the Accounting 2102 in the Echo? No? Okay. Have you tried going in and out? Okay, well let's just, if you could tell me, 4 people have got it working. Can you put your hand up if you've got it working? Identify, you? Yeah? So, is there a trick? It just appeared? Okay. Excellent. Sorry to identify you, but... so the only trick I know is to log in and out of the Echo app and see if it updates so that Accounting 2102 appears. Okay, well I'm not going to hold everyone up with that, but if you can please have a play around. So the answer Oh, we've got 8 submissions. What does everyone say? 4 say batch level, 5 say batch level, 2 product level and 2 facility. So the majority got it right. So why is cleaning a batch level? Well, the orders can be 1 tub of ice cream or 4 tubs of ice cream, but we only clean the machine after each order. So it's therefore not unit level, but it's batch level. So the batch is the order. Does that make sense? It's not product level activity because we have both vanilla or chocolate ice cream, and it's not at the facility level because it's actually related to that particular batch of ice cream. Okay. Oh, sorry. So the next question is similar, it's the same information, but the question is, does increasing the number of units in a batch, increasing the number of units in a batch will increase the batch level costs associated with the product. Is that true or false? So if we increase the number of units in a batch, will that change the batch level costs? So is this statement true or false? Okay, so, the majority were right again, so it's false. Increasing the number of units in a batch will increase the batch level costs associated with the product. Well, that's not correct because the cost of cleaning doesn't change. So if there's 4 tubs of ice cream, the total cost of cleaning each time you make a new batch doesn't change if there's 2 tubs of ice cream. Okay? Okay. So, which of the following would be considered a product level activity in relation to the same information about ice cream? I don't think I've got this as an activity, so we'll just walk through them. So, is building a prototype of a product level activity? What do you think? Is building a prototype of a product level activity? Yes. Yep. What about creating the company's advertising campaign? Facility sustaining? It's about the company, not about the actual product. What about training your warehouse employees? Is that product level? No, because you don't have no information about whether it relates just to that product. Okay? What about inspecting each unit of product? Is that a product level activity? No, it's a unit level activity. Fantastic. Okay, so some examples of major activities and cost drivers. If we're talking about the activity of processing purchase orders, what's going to drive the cost of that is the number of purchase orders that we process. If we're talking about handling materials and parts, what will drive that typically is the number of material requisitions. If we're talking about inspecting incoming materials, it will be the number of receipts. So if we have more purchases and we're doing inspections of each thing that we purchase, the more purchases we have as represented by the number of receipts will drive the inspection costs. And I think the rest of them are fairly obvious, but to give you an idea of what you should be looking for when you're reading a case, you're going to have to identify first of all, what are the activities that are using resources and what could potentially be the cost drivers of those activities. So in this example, where we've got the deluxe and the regular, and we've got the costs here of setting up the equipment, moving the goods, and machining and assembly, they ask us if total overhead costs are allocated using machine hours, would the cost of deluxe and regular lines be accurate for economic decision making? What do you think? If we just used a single allocation rate with machine hours as our cost allocation base, would we get accurate costs for deluxe and regular? Knowing what we know about use of activities. What do you think? Do they use activities differently? Is there a consumption ratio difference? Yes. So it's unlikely that using an average will give you an accurate cost, because the two products use different proportions of the activities. So we want to calculate the cost of a unit of each product using machine hours as the allocation base. So this is a traditional system, traditional costing system, using machine hours as our allocation base. So the first thing that we want to do is work out our allocation rate. So we know our total activity costs are 4,000 because it tells us in the question. We know that our total machine hours is 50 hours. So we know our cost allocation rate is $80 per machine hour. Does everyone know where I get that information from? All good? Okay, so if we're allocating to deluxe and regular, all we have to do is take the machine hours times the use, the rate times the use. So for the deluxe, we'll have 800 in overhead or activity costs. For the regular, we will have 40 times 80, so we will have 3,200. We need to add on our prime costs. Prime costs are the direct materials and our direct labour. So we have 800 for deluxe and 8,000 for our regular. But that's in total, so our total cost is 1,600 and 11,200. So if we want to work out the cost per unit, we divide by the number of units that we produce. So we produce 10 deluxe. So using a traditional costing system, it's 160 per unit of deluxe, and regular, it will be 112 per unit. Okay, so that's what we're used to doing when we do our traditional costing using a single plant-wide rate. But here we have information so that we can do a very simple activity-based costing and compare the results under the two methods. So for deluxe and regular, we still have the same prime costs. Remember, that's our direct materials and direct labour. But we're going to allocate based on the activities. So we have to come up with a rate. So for setups, we know from the question, our total setup costs are 1,200. How many setups in total do we have? How many setup hours? 4. So we know that it's 300 per hour. And for deluxe, we have 3 hours. And for regular, we have 1 hour. So that's $300. For moving, how do I work out my rate? What do I divide? To work out my rate, for moving goods? Sorry, to work out the actual rate, how much does it cost me to move my goods? Yeah, but what's the actual cost? My moving goods, the total activity cost is 800. Yep. And I divide that by the total number of moves, which is 10, to get my rate, which is 80. And then I use the relationship. So I take 80 times 6. And 80 times 4, which is 320. So you go through and you do that for each of the different categories. So we've got machining and assembly. So machining, we know is $1,500 in total, and we divide that by the 50 machine hours. So we know it's $30 per hour. So the first one we use 10 machine hours, so that's 300, and the second we use 40 machine hours, so that's 1,200. And the final one is assembly. So the total cost of assembly is 500, and we divide that by the total direct labour hours of 100. So it's $5 per labour hour. We use 28 labour hours for deluxe, and we use 80 for the regular. So all we do is we add these, our prime costs, with all the activity costs, and we end up $2,580, and we divide that by 10 because we produce 10. So our cost per unit using this more accurate and sophisticated or refined system is 258 per unit of deluxe, whereas for our regular, it costs us 10,220 divided by 100, and the cost per unit is $102.20. So what's happened, if we compare, under the traditional system, our more complex product was 160 per unit, the deluxe. Under the more accurate system, we know that it actually costs 258 per unit. So is that under or over costed? If under the traditional system it's 160, and under the more refined system it's 258, was it under or over costed? Under costed. And our simple product was over costed by $10 per unit. All good? Because we just used a broad average and it didn't reflect the actual use of the activity. So this is an example of product cost cross-subsidisation, and it's a problem with simple costing systems where you get cost distortion. So we're likely to underprice our deluxe and overprice our regular using a traditional costing system. Okay, so another quick check activity, a little bit more complicated now, so I'll put the question up on the doc cam, I hope. Okay, so here we've got two products. We've got the standard product and the deluxe product. We've got two activities. We've got activity A, which is batch related, and that's the setups, and that's the total cost of activity A. And activity B, which is related to the components, and we have 8 components in the standard and 12 in deluxe. So what we want you to do is assume ABC system is used and calculate the total amount of overhead cost assigned to the standard model. So be careful when you're answering questions what they're asking you for. Here it's the total amount of overhead cost for a particular product. So I'll give you a few minutes to attempt that. Okay, so we've got 5 people have kindly answered and they have all got it right, which is fantastic. So how do we get to 24,800? So for activity A, we know the total cost is 20,000 and we know the total number of setups is 50. So we know the cost per setup is 400. For activity B, our cost per component, we calculate by taking 40,000 and dividing that by the total components of 20. So we know that the cost per component is 2,000. So we can work out for standard, we use 22 setups at $400 a setup, plus we had 8 components at $2,000 per component, so our total is 24,800. Okay, so I'll just put the third activity up for you. So what we want to know, it's a little bit more complicated. We want to know the amount of overhead allocated to 1 unit of the basic model. Sorry, have I moved you on too quickly? Yeah. So this is a little bit trickier because they haven't actually told you the number of setups, but that's okay because we're actually at the unit level. So we know how many units we have in each setup. So you can work out the cost per unit, the setup cost per unit. And they're asking us how much overhead is allocated to 1 unit of the basic model. Any brave soul's going to put an answer in? Nobody? Yes? Has anyone got an answer? Oh, one person. Excellent. Okay. So, it's just what we're allocating. Okay. Nearly. Thank you for putting an answer in. We've got a starting point. Okay, so we've got 3 activities. We've got materials, and we're just working it out for the basic model. And we know materials, the cost driver is the number of parts, and we have 10 parts, and they tell us it's $2 per part. So that's $20. Then setup, the number of setups, we know that it's $500 per setup, and we know that there is 250 parts in each batch, 250 of the basic gizmo in each batch. So we know that for each gizmo, basic gizmo, that's $2 in setup cost per unit. Does everyone understand that? So we take the 500 per setup divided by the number of units in a batch, and we get $2 for a unit. And the final one is the quality inspection, and that's given to us in time. We know that an inspection is $90 per hour, and we take 10 minutes, which is 1/6 of an hour. So if we take that 90 divided by 6, that gives us 15. So the total that's allocated is 37B. So everyone got that? $20 for the materials, 2 for the setup, and 15 for the quality inspection. Okay, so it's a little bit trickier. If we'd also included our Total, if we want a total cost, we'd add on the 50 and the 75. Okay? So the next question is, what are the total costs of the advanced model? So you should be able to apply the same principles, but you also need to include direct materials and labour to give us the total cost of the advanced model. Okay. Oh, okay. So a split decision. So what do? We have our direct materials, our direct labour, and then we want to do our cost of materials receiving, which we know is based on the number of parts, which is 15 times $2 per part. Okay, so that will give us another 30. Then we have our product, our setup, and in this case we know still know it's $500 per setup, but we only have 100 units. So now it's $5 per unit for setup. And then we have the quality inspection, and this time it takes 20 minutes, which is a third of an hour, and it's $90 an hour. So we divide 90 by 3, and that gives us 30. So if we add that together, we get 285. Okay, does that make sense? Great. Okay, so you can expect to have a case where perhaps you've got an organisation that produces lots of different products and is having difficulty in some way because they are having a problem that they don't understand why they can't compete or something like that. Okay. Why won't you move on? And you'll need to use your skills that you've learned about costing systems to solve their problem. So when and why would we use ABC? We'd use ABC when a business has poor costing system symptoms, things like if you can't explain a product's profits or losses, you're selling a product well below or above your competitors' prices, you don't win tenders when you go out and you know that you're good at that, doing that particular job. The cost of the current system is not intuitive. What do we mean by that? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that you're good at making something and yet the costs seem to be higher than you'd expect them to be. The products that you're well suited to make and sell show small profits. You start thinking, gosh, what's wrong with my costing system? And if there's disagreements with your operational staff and your accounting staff because the operational staff are saying, hey, we don't understand these costs. And you also know that there's a significant amount of indirect costs that are currently allocated only using one or two cost pools, or all or most indirect costs are identified as output non-unit level costs. So they're either batch, product sustaining, or facility sustaining costs. And you know that you have product diversity. They make diverse demands on your resources because of some process or volume or batch size or complexity of the product. Okay, so it was a management consultant in the US who came up with this activity-based costing system. Now, there's been lots of studies, so it was very popular, and there's been lots of studies about the implementation of the system in organisations, and it hasn't always been successful. So what have we learned? ABC costing systems are costly to develop and implement. Because you've got lots of cost pools, you have to keep track of those different costs of activities, and you have to keep track of the use of the cost driver. So you can imagine it gets quite expensive. Information in them can be misleading because you may not be able to actually get the cost driver that you identify. You might have to use some other information that's more readily available, and so it might not be as accurate as you had wanted it to be. So occasionally managers are forced to use allocation bases for which they have data readily available rather than what's most accurate. So there's this other kind of activity-based costing which is time-driven. But that involves actually physically timing how long it takes to do all these activities and using minutes as your cost driver. So that's very expensive too, but it has been tried. And also they've found when they've studied activity-based costing in situ in organisations that there can be behavioural issues associated with it. So lots of resistance from managers and employees because they don't really understand it, and uncertainty about the potential benefits. And so why would we invest in such a system if we don't really understand what the benefits of that system are? So finally, what we want to talk about is how ABC relates to activity-based management. So we know that ABC is about understanding the activities that use resources that drive your costs and creating cost pools and cost bases and allocation rates based on those activities. So you can imagine that managers get more information than they do if you just use a single cost allocation rate. So that information helps them to make better informed decisions. So if I know that I'm doing a lot of setups for my deluxe model as a manager and I'm trying to reduce costs, I would try and think of ways to ensure that my setups, I use fewer setups. Perhaps I can make the batch sizes larger. Activity-based management is the process of using this information as an integral part of making your decisions about managing your business's activities. Because if you want to become more efficient, those activities are what we need to manage. So we want to make improved decisions that both satisfy our customers. So if we are able to cost our product more accurately, reduce our costs by managing the activities that we're now tracking, we can both get our customers the price they want without losing quality, and that can also improve our profits. So activity-based management, so that just means using the information from our activity-based costing system about the activities that we use to make our products, helps by improving product pricing and product mix decisions. All this means is if we have less cost distortion, we understand better what the actual costs of our product are, we can make a better decision of on how much of each type of product to be making. That's what we mean by product mix. By reducing our costs and improving processes, we can be more efficient, improve our designs. If we understand that part of our costs are driven by the fact we have lots of parts and therefore it takes a lot more overhead to put together something with more parts rather than less parts, we might actually redesign our product to have fewer parts. Improving customer satisfaction from better pricing, we've talked about that. And improve our planning. If we understand what's driving our costs, we can better forecast our costs in the future because we can understand the relationship between activities and output. So you'll often find that activity-based management might also involve things like total quality management, so continuous quality improvement, process improvement and process re-engineering. All that means is that you go back and look at what you're actually doing and make changes to improve efficiencies, reduce activities involved in the production process. So we've talked about manufacturing organisations, but it's equally applicable, in fact probably more helpful in service industries, because service industries have a lot of indirect costs. So ABC has been used for strategic decisions rather than for inventory valuation in merchandising companies, because it helps merchandisers to understand what drives their costs in terms of activity, and you can manage the activities. The majority of cost structure in the service companies are indirect costs, so activity-based costing is very helpful because it enables us to understand what drives those indirect costs. But it can be difficult to implement in service firms because a lot of the costs are facility sustaining costs, and that proves problematic in estimating a service cost. Often the individual activities are difficult to identify because they're non-repetitive. So if you think about a hospital, there are lots of repetitive activities, but there's also some very specific activities related to patient care that wouldn't happen for every single patient. So the non-repetitive environment makes it difficult to identify service outputs. So that makes it difficult to implement this type of system, although a lot of our healthcare organisations have activity-based funding and some are using time-driven activity-based costing. It's a very complex environment. Okay, so this is an example that we'll go through at the beginning of our next lecture. So please remember, next week is your online quiz. You don't have to do it in this room. Do not come to this room. If you have any questions, please email or come to consult. Thank you. It's Wallace, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
So
I'll just turn this off.
okay.